It was a Wednesday morning in March of 2011 when I first walked onto the Alderman property. The frost hadn't fully let go of the ground yet. You could feel it in the way the grass crunched under your boots. Not enough to crunch, really, more of a soft give that wasn't quite right. Like the earth hadn't decided whether it was still winter or not. I remember because I had driven out early, before my coffee had even settled, and the fog was sitting low across the bottom field, the kind that doesn't burn off until well past 9. The old Alderman place was 11 miles east of Haskell County's center, down a gravel road that had more washboard to it than the county had any intention of fixing. 83 acres, mixed use, about 40 in hay ground, the rest in timber and scrub. There was a farmhouse that hadn't been lived in since the mid-90s, a machine shed that had gone halfway to the ground on its north wall, and one large barn standing out back, cedar-sided, gambrel roof, still mostly upright if you squinted. The estate had been sitting in probate for nearly 2 years. The last alderman, a man named Rupert, had died in the spring of 2009, without a will anyone could find and without children anyone knew about. The county had eventually gotten involved, and an auctioneer named Dave Crenshaw out of Parsons had been hired to assess and liquidate what was left. Dave had walked through the property in November of 2010 and written in his assessment, plain as anything. The barn structure contains no equipment, no stored inventory, and no items of recoverable value. The interior floor is earthen, no basement or subfloor present. I had no reason to doubt him. Dave Crenshaw had been doing estate assessments in southeast Kansas for 30 years. He knew what an empty barn looked like. But something about that barn didn't sit right with me. I'm not sure I can explain it better than that. I had driven past the Alderman place maybe a dozen times over the years. It sat close enough to the county road that you could see it from your truck window, and there was something about the way that barn stood that I had always noticed without ever really looking at. It was the proportion of it, maybe, or the way the foundation stones were laid. Something that registered in the back of your mind the way a wrong note in a hymn registers. You don't call it out, but you hear it. My name is Earl Mabry. I'm 67 years old now, and I've been farming in Haskell County my whole life, same as my father did, same as his father did before him. I raise wheat and milo mostly, and I keep a small cow-calf operation on the north end of my place. I'm not a wealthy man, and I've never pretended to be. But I know land, and I know old buildings, and I know when something has been built with more intention than the occasion called for. That's what I kept thinking about on the drive out that March morning. My wife, Loretta, passed in the fall of 2006, pancreatic cancer. We had 31 years together, and I won't say more than that because I don't think there's more to say. After she was gone, I found myself doing things I wouldn't have done when she was alive, driving back roads at odd hours, stopping to look at properties that weren't for sale, going to estate auctions not because I needed anything, but because the act of looking at what a person had accumulated over a lifetime felt like something worth doing. Like a way of being in the world that didn't require you to speak. The Alderman auction was scheduled for the second Saturday in April. I had no particular plan when I drove out that Wednesday. I just wanted to see the place before the crowd got to it. I parked my truck on the near side of the cattle guard and walked in through the gap where the gate had come off its hinges. The farmhouse was past saving. The roof had let in enough water over 15 winters that the ceilings had gone, and the front porch had folded at one end like a table with a broken leg. I walked around it without going in. The machine shed I looked at briefly. An old cultivator frame, some fence posts stacked against the wall, a single tire rim leaned against the door frame. Nothing worth much. Then I walked back to the barn. Up close it was bigger than it looked from the road, 40 feet wide, maybe 60 deep. The cedar siding had gone gray the way cedar does, silver gray with a grain that stood out like veins. The sliding door on the south end was off its track but still mostly in place. I had to lean into it to get it to move. It groaned once and then slid open about 4 feet, which was enough. Inside, the light came in through gaps in the siding, long, thin strips of March light falling across the floor at low angles. Dust moved in the light, smelled of old hay and dried wood, and something else underneath that I couldn't immediately name, something cool and mineral, the way a root cellar smells when you first open it in spring. Dave Crenshaw had been right that there was no equipment. The stalls along the east wall were empty. The loft was empty, I could tell from where I was standing, looking up through the opening. A few old harness hooks remained bolted to the beam above the stalls, and there was a coil of rotted rope up near the peak, but nothing else. The floor was dirt, the way earthen barn floors are packed hard over decades of use, dark with old moisture and oil and whatever gets ground into a floor when animals have stood on it for years. It was level, more or less, even. But not everywhere. Along the west wall in the northwest corner, there was a section roughly 8 feet by 10 where the floor looked different. It was subtle enough that you might walk right past it in different light. The packed earth had the same color, more or less, but the texture was off. The rest of the floor had that pressed, almost glazed look that old earthen floors develop over time. This section looked, and I'm trying to find the right word, younger somehow. The grain of it was finer, less settled. I walked over and crouched down. I pushed my thumbnail into the surface. It gave a fraction more than the floor around it. I stood back up and looked at it again. The more I looked, the less sense it made. I went back to my truck and got my 3-foot pry bar out of the bed. Not because I knew what I was going to do with it, but because it was there, and I had the habit of having a pry bar nearby when I was looking at old buildings. I carried it back inside and crouched down again in the northwest corner. I pushed the flat end of the pry bar into the dirt at the edge of that patch and pressed down. The bar went in maybe 1.5 inches before it stopped. Not hit rock, not hit a root. It hit wood. I did not start digging that morning. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't my property and I had no claim to whatever was under there. I took the pry bar back to my truck, drove home, and thought about it. Over the next 2 days, I thought about it more than I had any practical reason to. I'm not an excitable man. I know that about myself. I have gone whole weeks of farming without anything rising above the level of quiet attention, a stuck valve, a fence section that needed replacing, a heifer that was late coming into season. The drama of farming is mostly small and mostly slow. You get accustomed to a certain pace of revelation. But this sat differently. On Thursday evening, I called my son, Dale, who farms with me and lives about a 1/4 mile down the road. I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Dad, it's probably just a fill patch. Maybe they had a wet spot in that corner and filled it at some point. Or maybe they buried something. Old dog, maybe." "Could be," I said. "You're not seriously thinking about going back out there?" "The auction's Saturday week," I said. "I was thinking about bidding on the land." Dale was quiet again. Then, "The land priced at $42,000. You don't need 83 acres. "I know. Dave Crenshaw walked that whole property." "I know he did." Dale sighed the way he sighs when he has already decided he's not going to change my mind. He gets that from his mother. The patience to let a thing run its course. I didn't call Dave Crenshaw. There was no reason to, officially. But I did drive out to Parsons on Friday morning and stop into his office on account of some other business I'd invented, and in the course of the conversation I asked him about the Alderman barn. He described it pretty much the way he'd written it up. Empty, earthen floor, no subfloor. "What about the northwest corner?" I said. "Did you notice anything different about the floor there?" He looked at me over the tops of his reading glasses. "Earl, I've assessed maybe 400 barns in this county. They all look about the same to me at this point." I nodded and left it at that. There was a man my father used to talk about. His name was Gideon Farber, and he had farmed about 6 miles north of where I grew up, back in the 1950s and early 1960s. Gideon had come from somewhere in Pennsylvania. Originally, my father was vague on the details, and he had a reputation for building things in a particular way: heavy timber framing, stone foundations. He overbuilt everything, my father said, as if he expected his work to outlast not just himself but everyone who came after him. I don't know why the Alderman barn made me think of Gideon Farber. I had not thought about him in years, maybe decades, but something about the foundation stones on that barn, the way they were laid, the thickness of them, the careful fitting, pulled that memory up from wherever it had been sitting. I went home Friday evening and found my father's old notebook. He kept a notebook from about 1962 until shortly before he died in 1997. Not a diary, exactly, more of a record. Observations about the weather, about yields, about equipment repairs, about his neighbors and what they were doing and what he thought of it. My father was a quiet man who noticed everything and spoke about very little of it. The notebooks were where it all went. I hadn't opened them in a long time. I sat down at the kitchen table under the overhead light and worked through them slowly, starting with the earlier ones. The handwriting was small and even, the kind of penmanship you don't see much anymore. Every page smelled of old paper and something slightly sweet, maybe the leather cover, maybe just age. I found the first mention of Gideon Farber about halfway through the 1963 notebook. My father had written, G. Farber finished the storage work he was doing for Carl Alderman. Took him better part of the summer. Carl wouldn't say what it was for. That was all. I went to the next notebook, the 1964 one. In August, Carl Alderman sold 3 sections of his original ground, kept the home place. Word is he needed the cash in a hurry. Gideon says he doesn't know why. I believe him and I don't. I sat there for a while with that. Carl Alderman. That would have been Rupert Alderman's father or possibly grandfather. I wasn't sure of the generations. Storage work, that was the phrase. I kept thinking about it. The next morning, Saturday, I drove back out to the Alderman place. I told myself I was just looking. I brought the pry bar again, and a flat spade, and a flashlight, and I told myself those were just things I happened to have in my truck. The barn was the same. The light was different, overcast that day, a flat gray light with a cold wind coming from the northwest, the kind of wind that carries a promise of more cold before it turns warm. The grass around the barn had gone yellow and flat over winter and hadn't fully come back. I went inside. I looked at the northwest corner again. Then I started digging. The top 1.5 inches of soil came up easily with the spade. Underneath was a plank, a single wide plank probably 14 inches across, running the full length of that 8-foot section. I worked along the edge of it with the pry bar until I found where it was attached. It wasn't nailed down. It was held by 2 wooden pegs set into a frame beneath it. The frame was built from 4x6 oak timbers, old growth by the look of them, set flush into the earthen floor. I got the pry bar under the edge of the plank and levered it up. Beneath it was another plank, set perpendicular. And beneath that one, when I got it up, was a third. They formed a trapdoor of sorts, though that's not quite the right word for it. It was more like a hatch, the kind of heavy, deliberate construction that someone built with the intention of it lasting, and the intention of it not being found casually. The wood was dense and had not rotted, which told me something about either the quality of it or the conditions below, or both. Below the third plank was a shaft. Concrete-lined walls about 3 feet by 4 feet across, a wooden ladder also intact, and below that I shone my flashlight down a floor roughly 8 feet down, packed earth, dry. I stood there for a good while, with the flashlight aimed down into that hole. It was not nothing. It was also not what I had imagined because I hadn't let myself imagine much. It was a space, a room almost, small but deliberate. I thought about my father's notebook, storage work. I thought about the mineral smell I had noticed the first time I walked into this barn. Then I put the flashlight between my teeth and climbed down the ladder. The space at the bottom was larger than the shaft suggested. The walls flared out on three sides, creating a low-ceilinged room perhaps 12 feet across in one direction and 8 in the other. The ceiling was reinforced with timber, the kind of construction you saw in old root cellars and storm shelters. Low, you could stand if you were under 5'10". I am 5'8", so I stood. The floor was indeed dry. The walls were concrete block on the lower half, fieldstone on the upper half. Someone had mortar sealed every joint with care. Along the north wall there were shelves. Built-in wood, constructed the same way the hatch had been, heavy, careful, built to last. Most of them were empty. But not all of them. On the middle shelf in the center there were 3 items. A metal box, roughly the size of a large shoebox, with a hinged lid and no lock. A glass jar with a lid, the old Bayland rubber seal type. And a canvas roll, like the kind used to hold chisels or woodworking tools, about 16 inches long and tied with a leather strap. I did not touch them immediately. I stood in that room and looked at the shelves for a while, looked at the empty spaces where other things had presumably been at some point, looked at the walls, the floor, the construction of the ceiling timbers. Whoever built this room had built it to protect things from moisture, from heat, from fluctuation. This was not a hiding place built in a hurry. This was not something built with a single purpose in mind. This was built by someone who thought carefully about time. The name Gideon Farber went through my head again. I reached for the metal box first. Inside the metal box were papers. Not loose papers, but folded documents, the kind with the stiff, formal feeling of old legal work. I took them up carefully. The paper was brittle at the folds but otherwise intact, and held them under my flashlight. The top document was a land survey, dated 1931. The property described was the Alderman home place. The legal description matched what I knew of the acreage. The survey was hand-drawn and precise, with notations in a tight script that indicated elevations, water features, and boundary markers. Beneath it was a second document, a deed of transfer, dated November 14, 1938. The transfer was from a name I didn't recognize, Herman Vogt, to Carl W. Alderman. The property transferred was described as the northeast quarter of Section 22, and attached to the deed was a handwritten note on plain paper that said, in full, "Carl, I have kept my word. The rest is yours to keep or not as God allows. Do not let them take the water. H.V." I read that note 3 times. Do not let them take the water. I set the papers back in the box carefully and reached for the glass jar. Inside the jar, rolled tightly, were 2 items. A photograph, black and white, printed on the kind of thick paper stock they used in the 1930s and 40s, and a folded sheet of stationery. The photograph showed 4 men standing in front of what I was reasonably sure was the Alderman barn. The barn looked newer in the photograph. The siding was fresh and light. 2 of the men I didn't know. One of them looked like a younger version of the kind of man who became old farmers, broad shoulders, overalls, serious expression. The 4th man was standing slightly apart from the others and was dressed differently, in what looked like a city suit, and was not looking at the camera but at something off to the left. I turned the photograph over. On the back in pencil 4 names: Carl, Reuben, Gideon, F. Hendricks, Aug., 1952. Gideon, that would be Gideon Farber. F. Hendricks, the man in the suit, not looking at the camera. I unfolded the stationery. It was a letter, handwritten, and it began, "Carl, I am writing this because I will not say it aloud where it can be heard." I read that letter standing in the room beneath the Alderman barn with the flashlight in one hand and the paper in the other, and I will try to tell you what it said as plainly as I can. The letter was from a man named Frank Hendricks. Based on the contents, he had been an officer of the Haskell County Farm Credit Association at some point in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The letter was not dated, but the context placed it somewhere around 1952 or 1953. Hendricks wrote that there was a plan. He used that word carefully, with quotation marks around it, a plan being discussed at the county level to reroute the drainage and water rights in the lower eastern section of the county. The rerouting would benefit several larger landholders who had connections to certain men in the county commission. The effect of the rerouting, as Hendricks described it, would be to eliminate the natural water source that fed the eastern portion of the alderman land, a spring-fed creek that ran through the lower pasture and had been the primary reason the land held its value. Without the creek, Hendricks wrote, the eastern 40 acres would be worth almost nothing. And without those 40 acres as collateral, the alderman note at the Farm Credit Association, the loan Carl Alderman carried on his equipment, could be called in as undercollateralized. If they call the note, Hendricks wrote, you will not be able to meet it, and they know that. I am telling you this because you have been a fair man and your father was a fair man. I cannot stop what they are doing, but I am telling you so that you can do what you must. That was the letter. I stood there for a while in that underground room, in the dry, cool air, with the smell of old paper in my hands and the sound of the March wind somewhere far above me, moving through the gaps in the cedar siding. Carl Alderman had built this room, or had Gideon Farber built it the summer before or the summer after receiving that letter. He had stored papers in it, records perhaps, evidence of the water rights, the survey, the original deed, the things that would prove what the land was and what it had always been. He had built a vault below his barn floor in 1952 or 1953 because someone had told him the land might be taken from him through paperwork, and he had decided that the paperwork that proved otherwise was going to be preserved somewhere no one would think to look for it. And it had worked, in a fashion. The Alderman family had kept that land for another 60 years. I set the letter back in the jar, sealed it, and reached for the canvas roll. The canvas roll contained maps, hand-drawn on heavy drafting paper that had yellowed but not crumbled, 3 of them. Each one showed the Alderman property in detail, with the creek marked in blue pencil, its course traced carefully from where it entered the property at the northeast corner to where it crossed under the county road at the southwest. Along the creek, at 5 or 6 points, there were small annotations, measurements of depth, flow notations, seasonal variations. Whoever had made these maps had spent time studying that creek over at least a couple of years. This was not casual work. On the back of the third map was a note in a different handwriting than the Hendricks letter. It said, Gideon measured this in June and again in September. Water level never below 18 inches at the main crossing. This creek does not dry. Anyone who says otherwise has not looked. I unrolled the maps as carefully as I could and looked at them for a long time. The creek they showed, I had seen it on aerial photos of the property, but I had not thought much about it. It still ran. I had noticed it from the road. Whatever plan Frank Hendricks had described in his letter, it hadn't succeeded, or hadn't fully succeeded, or had been abandoned. The water was still there. The land had stayed in the family. But Carl Alderman hadn't known it would. In 1952 or 1953, he had been frightened enough, or cautious enough, or wise enough to build a room underground and fill it with evidence. And then he had covered it over and packed the dirt down and let 60 years go by on top of it. I thought about what it would have felt like to do that, to build something that carefully and then to walk away from it, back to your daily life, not knowing whether you would ever need what you had hidden. I climbed back up the ladder slowly. My knees reminded me I wasn't young. The March wind hit me when I got to the top, and it felt cold and clean after the still air below. I stood in the barn for a moment and thought about what I was going to do. I was standing on property that wasn't mine yet. The auction was still a week away. I had opened a hatch in a floor and climbed into a room that I had no legal standing to be in, and I had handled documents that belonged to whoever ultimately took possession of the estate. I put everything back the way I had found it. The maps in the canvas roll, the letter in the jar and the photograph in the box on the middle shelf. I climbed back down to check that I hadn't disturbed anything. Then I climbed back up, set the planks back in their frame, and raked the loose soil back over the top of them as best I could with the flat of my hand in the back of the spade. I walked out of the barn into the gray March morning. I drove home. I did not tell anyone what I had found, not Dale, not the auctioneer, not the county. I sat on it for a week, and I thought about it in the way you think about something that doesn't quite fit the frame you have for it. I kept coming back to a man named Carl Alderman, who I had never met, building a room in 1952 because someone had warned him that the thing he had might be taken. And I kept coming back to the letter from Hendricks, who had clearly known he was doing something that could cost him and had done it anyway, for no reason except that Carl was a fair man and his father had been a fair man. There is a kind of loyalty in that I don't have a better word for. I went to the auction on the second Saturday in April. It was a cold day with thin sunlight and a wind that came in gusts off the open ground. There were maybe 30 people there, local farmers, a couple of real estate investors from the city, a few people I didn't know the purpose of. Dave Crenshaw ran the auction from the back of his truck with a handheld microphone. The outbuildings sold first, as scrap value. The machine shed went for $400 to a man named Tucker who farms east of town and collects old metal. The farmhouse was sold as a teardown to a salvage outfit from Wichita. $250 for whatever they could pull out before it fell in entirely. Then the land. The bidding started at $38,000. It moved in fits and starts. 2 investors ran it up early, then one of them dropped off. I waited. At $44,000 the bidding slowed. One investor left at $46,000. At $47,500 I raised my paddle. Nobody responded. Dave Crenshaw looked around the crowd. He said, $47,500, do I have 48? He did not. He said sold. I took possession of the deed on a Thursday in May of 2011. That same afternoon I drove out to the property and walked it properly for the first time as the owner of it. I checked the creek first. It was running well for May, about knee-deep at the main crossing, clear and cold, with a good gravel bottom. I stood in it for a moment with my boots on and felt the current push against my legs. Good water. Old water, probably, the kind fed by something deeper than surface drainage. Carl Alderman had been right to fight for it. Then I walked back to the barn. I opened the hatch again and climbed down. Everything was where I had left it. I gathered the documents carefully, the land survey, the deed of transfer, the letter from Frank Hendricks, the photograph of the 4 men, the maps with Gideon Farber's measurements, and I brought them up into the light. I spread them out on the hood of my truck and looked at them in the May sunshine. The survey was dated 1931, 80 years old. The deed of transfer, 1938. The letter and the photograph and the maps, somewhere in the early 1950s. The newest of these documents was older than I was. They had been sitting in that room in the dry dark for 60 years or close to it, waiting for someone to come down and look. I spent the next several months trying to understand what I had found. I went to the County Historical Society in Subble, which is run by a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Foods, who knows more about the written record of Haskell County than anyone living. I showed her the documents, not all of them at once, and not explaining fully where I had found them at first, and she helped me piece together the context. Carl W. Alderman, she confirmed, had come to Haskell County in the late 1920s. He had bought the original property from a German immigrant family named Vogt. The Vogts had homesteaded that ground in the 1890s and held it through the dry years and the Depression before selling to Carl in 1938. Carl had farmed the place until his death in 1971. His son, Wayne Alderman. had taken over and run the place until a stroke took him in the late 1980s. After that, it had passed to Wayne's son Rupert, who had not farmed it but had held it, in the way that the last of a family sometimes holds onto a thing without quite being able to say why. About the water rights issue, Margaret knew less specifically, but she knew the general shape of it. There had been, she confirmed, a period in the early 1950s when several county commission members and their associates had been involved in a series of drainage and water rights decisions that had benefited certain landowners considerably. She used the word irregularities with the careful tone of someone describing something they believe to be true but cannot prove entirely. "Were there ever any consequences?" I asked her. She looked at me. "This is Haskell County in 1953, Earl. What do you think?" I told her what I thought and she nodded, and we left it at that. I asked her about Frank Hendricks. She went to her records. He had worked for the Farm Credit Association, she confirmed, from 1947 to 1954. He had left the county in 1954 and she had no record of him after that. "Left voluntarily," I said. She closed her folder. His house sold in June of 1954 for a price well below what it should have been. His name doesn't appear in the county record after that. Draw your own conclusions. I thought about the letter. I cannot stop what they are doing, but I am telling you so that you can do what you must. Whatever it had cost Frank Hendricks to write that letter, it appeared to have cost him more than he might have expected. And yet Carl Alderman had kept the water and kept the land, and built a room beneath his barn floor and filled it with the proof of what was true, just in case. I called Margaret Foods a few weeks later and told her where I had found the documents. She was quiet for a moment and then said she would like to see the room if I was willing to show her. I said I was. We went out on a Saturday morning in early June, warm by then, the grass green and the creek running clear. She was 71 years old and had bad hips, but she climbed down that ladder without complaint and stood in that room and looked at the shelves and the walls and the construction and didn't say anything for a good while. Then she said, "Gideon Farber." "You know about him?" I said. "I know about his work," she said. "I've seen his hand in 3 or 4 old buildings around the county. He had a particular way with timber framing." She ran her hand along one of the ceiling beams. "This is him." "He left too," I said, "after whatever happened." "Sometime in the late 50s, she said. "I don't know exactly when or where he went." She paused. "He was a good builder, it's a shame." We stood in that room for a while longer in the quiet. I had the documents professionally conserved later that year. There's an archivist at the university in Lawrence who does that kind of work. The materials are stored now in acid-free folders in a box in my office. I have made copies and given a set to the County Historical Society, where Margaret Foods has incorporated them into the collection under the Alderman family history. The room beneath the barn I did not fill in. I repaired the hatch and reinforced the ladder and installed a proper latch, and I keep the room clean and dry. I don't use it for anything. It seems wrong to use it for anything. I go down there occasionally in the evening sometimes, and I stand in it and think about Carl Alderman building it in 1952, and about Gideon Farber laying the concrete and fitting the timbers, and about Frank Hendricks writing a letter he couldn't say aloud. I think about Rupert Alderman, who lived his whole adult life above that room and apparently never knew it was there. His father Wayne never told him, or Wayne never knew himself. Carl had built the room, and whatever crisis he had built it against had passed, and the years had gone by, and eventually only the room remembered. There are things I wonder about still. I wonder why Herman Vogt sold the land to Carl in 1938. The note attached to the deed said I have kept my word, which implies an agreement made earlier. Under what circumstances, I don't know. I wonder whether the water rights effort in the 1950s was ever fully documented anywhere else, or whether Carl's hidden survey and Gideon's careful measurements are the only record of it that survives. I wonder where Frank Hendricks went after 1954, and whether he knew, years later, that the man he had written that letter to had kept the land. I wonder about Gideon Farber, who built something in 1952 and 1953 that outlasted everyone who knew what it was and everyone who built it, standing solid in the dark beneath an empty barn floor for 60 years, holding documents in dry air, waiting. Dale came out to see the place in the fall of 2011 after I had gotten the hay ground back into production. We walked the fence lines and checked the creek and walked the timber on the east end. He didn't say anything about having told me I didn't need the land. He's got his mother's sense about when to leave things alone. At the end of the afternoon, we went into the barn. I showed him the hatch, and we climbed down, and he stood in that room and looked around at the walls and the empty shelves and the single beam of light coming down from the shaft. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "How did you know it was here?" I thought about it. I didn't, I said. Something about the barn didn't sit right. I kept thinking about it, so I came back. He nodded the way he does. We climbed back up and slid the barn door shut behind us and walked out into the late afternoon light, the creek running somewhere in the east pasture, the grass gold with October, the sky clear and cold and wide over the flat Kansas ground. I have farmed that land for 14 years now. The creek has not dried.